Okay, we will now move on to our next field update, and that is Mark Swartz, Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing, I believe is in Illinois. Is that correct, Mark?
That's right, Chicago.
Yep. Okay, great. So take it away.
Well, thanks. So I've been asked to talk about the Chicago Right to Counsel pilot. Our advocacy on right to counsel is an outgrowth of our policy and court reform work, and it's very informed by our eviction data portal. So I'd like to start there. Next slide. LCBH launched a Chicago Evictions Data Portal as a resource to help policymakers and advocates investigate Chicago's chronic eviction problem using the eviction court data. We now have a decade's worth of data, which is a very good thing because on the other side of it, we're also very strong proponents of sealing the majority of evictions. The data portal has shown us that 40% of evictions result in dismissal. And then when you add those to the not for cause filings, all of these, in our opinion, should be sealed. Next slide, please. Our data looks a lot like what others are producing around the country. Still, I do think that local data is important for informing policy work. Before the portal in Chicago, we couldn't map eviction filings because addresses aren't included in the electronic docket. And so, even though everybody sort of has a sense of what's going on in eviction court and the disparate impact of people of color in eviction court, there wasn't really any way to determine where the evictions were being placed outside in the community. Now, policy and advocacy makers can click on our maps and they can see exactly what's going on in their wards and their communities. Next slide, please. So our map of Chicago looks a lot like other Chicago maps that show disparities because of Chicago's legacy of housing segregation. Still, our ability to break the eviction data down, again, to community area helps us with connecting with and empowering community-based organizers. Our ability to break the data down by ward helps us engage aldermanic offices. And people are very surprised when they see exactly what's going on in their communities. Next slide, please. Racial disparities in filing rates are jarring and getting worse. And again, it's the same as everywhere else in the country. This is just one local iteration of it. But we, in our most recent data poll, we've been, we update the data portal. We can't anymore because of there's a blanket eviction sealing that just sunset. I'll get into that in a minute. But we haven't been able to update the portal in a couple of years because the eviction data isn't available. But the last time we updated it, it showed that majority Black areas have eviction filing rates even higher than they were when the first time we pulled it. So majority Black areas have filing rates 5 times as high as majority white areas overall. Some of them have filing rates 8 times as high. Whereas majority Latinx areas are twice as high as majority white areas. Next slide, please. Another finding is that almost 2/3 of eviction cases claiming back rent were filed for less than $2,500. This was an important marker for us because that was the upper limit on our emergency rental assistance funds that the state homeless prevention program would provide per family in Chicago. And so using this data was allowed us to successfully argue for a court-based rental assistance program in the courthouse. This was all pre-pandemic. Next slide, please. Chicago's representation rates are likewise very similar to the national rates. Next slide, please. One set of findings that I think are unique to our data is that we break out eviction outcomes by legal aid attorneys. The data show that we have that having an attorney significantly reduces the chances that a tenant will receive an eviction order, but not by very much. Overall, tenants reduced their likelihood of receiving an eviction by about 25% when they had an attorney. But that's without looking at the legal aid attorneys. With a private attorney, a Chicago tenant's likelihood of getting an eviction was about 52%. So that's a little less than the 60% overall. But with a legal aid attorney, it drops down to 28%. And this has certainly informed how we look at designing a right to counsel program in Chicago. And what we're working with right now is a coalition of legal aid providers. Next slide, please. So this is the last substantive slide. A lot has happened since the pandemic, but I want to highlight that none of these developments enumerated here were born out of COVID. They've been in the works for some time as we've moved towards right to counsel, and in fact, were derailed for a time because of COVID. Some of the changes in law should disincentivize eviction filings. Others will reduce the barriers advocates face when representing renters so that we can bring more eviction cases to a just conclusion. And I want to go through these real quick, just in case you're interested in any of them. And if you want to discuss more offline with me, if any of these make sense to your jurisdiction, I'd love to talk to any of you. So the first is the Chicago Fair Notice Ordinance. Chicago advocates have been able to push for a lot of things. We're still working on just good cause, but I believe this ordinance grew out of the conversations for just good cause. It was sort of the consolation prize. And what it does is it extends the non-renewal notice period from 30 days to 60 days for renters who've lived in their units for 6 months or more. And it extends it to 120 days for renters who've lived in the apartment for more than 3 years. But most significantly, this fair notice ordinance allows tenants to cure up to the entry of the eviction judgment. And so for many of you, you're working in jurisdictions where after the notice period expires, to cure or quit, that's it. And it was the same in Chicago. So once we as legal aid would get a hold of a case, it was way after the 5-day notice period had expired. And now this allows renters to actually benefit from all the emergency rental assistance money that's out there right now. The Illinois Supreme Court issued a new procedural rule that requires that the demand for possession and notice of termination be attached to the complaint. Prior to that, in Illinois, there's no requirement that there be any allegations of exactly what the tenant is being alleged to have done to breach the lease. And the 10-day notice or 5-day notice or 30-day or whatever notice wasn't required to be attached. So legal aid attorneys were going in blind without knowing the specifics of the landlord allegations, and then getting discovery or getting the landlord to agree to show us these notices, let alone just for us to be able to determine when these notices were actually served, really put us at a great disadvantage. And it also just made, the process so much less transparent. So this rule should be very helpful as we move towards right to counsel, because now everything will be part of the court record, so that we as legal aid attorneys will have access to this as we determine our strategy in the case. The sealing, as we continue to level the playing field in eviction court, it's critical that tenants aren't penalized for filings that don't end in a judgment or for no fault filings. Some of our ideas for an eviction sealing curtain that would happen at the beginning of a case, so that tenants weren't, so that it wasn't, an eviction filing wasn't in the record, and then it would be opened up maybe if it was determined that the tenant had a judgment of some sort. These ideas were adopted in this emergency COVID bill that has sealed all evictions for the last 2 years during the pandemic period, and also has lowered the standard for tenants to go in and move for having their records sealed in older cases. But all of this is sunsetting. So the 2-year pandemic sealing curtain has sunset, and the ability for tenants to be able to move for their record to be sealed at this lower standard is going to sunset at the end of July. So we're really in clinic mode right now, trying to have as many clinics as we can to help people file these motions. And we do need to make these, we need to get this permanent now, because right now it's back to the way it was before, where a tenant really has to show that there was no basis in fact or law for the sealing. So I want to, in closing, I want to just say that Chicago is now very close to joining the civilized world in right to counsel. I should note, though, that the right to counsel pilot that we're taking on, we got a 3-year right to counsel pilot grant for $7.1 million, is not technically right to counsel because there's no legislation enshrining the right. It's very aspirational, but we have some really good partners When the moratorium ended, we began working with the Chicago Bar Foundation and the Eviction Court on an early resolution program. And this was one of the legal developments that was truly born out of COVID. Instead of eviction cases being set for trial on the first time up, they're now set for a status, and tenants are directed to legal aid attorneys for brief legal advice and to rental assistance screeners. And the partners are going to use this ERP program to screen tenants in court directly into the Right to Counsel program. Two of our partners in the early resolution program are also working on the Right to Counsel program. Carpools and their helpline, for those of you who know Chicago and Cook County, will help screen prospective tenants, and Legal Aid Chicago will join LCPH to take on the full representation cases. And finally, the Polk Foundation is committed to funding Stout, the people that did the cost-benefit analyses in New York and all these other jurisdictions, to perform a cost-benefit analysis for the Chicago region so that we can make arguments for legislation here. And so thanks for having me come on, and this is my contact information.